A government sold bonds in its own currency that had to be paid back in somebody else's. By December of 1994 it owed almost $30 billion on those bonds, and it had about $6 billion left in the vault to pay them with. On the evening of the 19th of December, 1994, Mexico's finance minister sat down with a group of the country's most powerful business leaders. He told them what the government intended to do the following morning: it was going to let the peso fall. The meeting has been argued about ever since, because of a simple question of sequence. The people in that room learned before the country did. By the time the announcement was public the next day, money was already moving. And the defense the government had built to survive that announcement lasted exactly 48 hours. 9 months earlier this had been the best story in the developing world. A country that had sold off its state industries, signed a trade agreement with the United States and Canada, and been admitted to the club of rich nations. Foreign money had poured in for 4 straight years. What almost nobody outside a very small circle understood was what that money had quietly been converted into. This is the Mexican peso crisis. Outside Mexico it is remembered by a nickname that makes it sound almost charming, the Tequila Crisis, as though it were a hangover rather than the year a middle class was destroyed. Inside Mexico it has a colder name, El Error de Diciembre. The December mistake. To understand the fall you have to understand how genuinely good the story was. Through the late 80s and early 90s Mexico did what economists had been telling developing countries to do for a generation. It cut its budget deficit. It sold hundreds of state-owned companies. It opened its markets. Inflation, which had run at over 100% in the late 80s, was brought down into single digits. And then came the crown. On the 1st of January, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement came into force, joining Mexico to the 2 largest economies on its continent. That same year Mexico was admitted to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the formal club of developed nations. On paper, the country had graduated. The banks were part of the same story. They had been nationalized in 1982 and were sold back to private owners in 1991 and 1992, at very high prices. The new owners had paid a great deal for them, which meant they needed to grow fast. Lending expanded at extraordinary speed into a population that had spent a decade barely able to borrow at all, and supervision did not expand with it. Holding the whole thing together was the exchange rate. Mexico did not fix the peso rigidly, the way Argentina would. It ran a managed band, letting the currency slide against the dollar by a small, pre-announced amount each day. Predictable. Boring. And that was the entire point. A stable currency was the proof that the reforms were working. Here is what a promise like that actually does. If a foreign investor believes the exchange rate will hold, then Mexican interest rates are simply free money. Lend in pesos, earn far more than you would at home, convert back at a rate you already know. The promise does not just attract capital. It attracts the most impatient kind, money that can leave in an afternoon. 1994 is the year everything arrived at once. On the very day the trade agreement took effect, an armed uprising began in the southern state of Chiapas. The Zapatistas took several towns and issued a declaration against precisely the economic model the world was applauding. The country that had just been declared modern was on the front pages for an insurrection. Then, on the 23rd of March, the governing party's presidential candidate, Luis Donaldo Colosio, was shot dead at a campaign rally in Tijuana. He was the man expected to be the next president. In a country whose ruling party had held power without interruption for 65 years, and whose entire pitch to investors was stability, a candidate had been assassinated in front of a crowd. Money began to leave. And it was leaving into a world that had just become more attractive without Mexico doing anything at all. Through 1994 the American Central Bank raised interest rates from 3% to nearly 6%. When the safest currency on earth starts paying you more, the reason to hold anything riskier gets smaller every month. Capital did not flee Mexico first. It was pulled. At that point a government has two honest options. It can devalue, let the currency fall to a level it can actually defend, take the pain, and move on. Or it can spend its hard currency reserves buying its own pesos to hold the rate up, and hope the pressure passes. The first option is humiliating in an election year. The second is invisible. Mexico chose to defend. Reserves went out the door to hold the line, roughly $29 billion in February, falling through the spring and summer while the official position remained that everything was under control. But defending a currency drains the exact resource you need in order to survive being wrong. And it does something worse, it buys time without buying a solution. Which brings us to the instrument at the center of this case, and to the sentence you should remember from it. Foreign investors were getting nervous about holding peso debt, because peso debt loses value the moment the peso does. So the government offered them something that removed exactly that fear. A short-term bond called a Tesobono. A Tesobono was issued in pesos and paid in pesos, but its value was indexed to the United States dollar. If the peso fell, the amount of pesos owed rose to match, so that the holder always got their dollar's worth back. To the investor it was a Mexican yield with the exchange rate risk removed. To the government it was a way to keep the money from leaving without admitting anything was wrong. Read that once more, because the trap is built into the definition. The exchange rate risk did not disappear. It was moved. Every Tesobono the government sold was a promise that if the currency collapsed, the state itself would cover the difference. The government had quietly become the insurer of the very event it was fighting to prevent, and it was writing more of those policies every week to fund the fight. Through 1994 the composition of the debt flipped. Ordinary peso bonds were replaced by dollar-indexed ones until nearly $30 billion of Tesobonos were outstanding, much of it maturing within months. Set that number beside the reserves that were left, and you have the whole crisis in one line, dollar obligations of about $29 billion, and about $6 billion to meet them. It is worth asking why this was not obvious to everyone. Part of the answer is that Mexico did not publish its reserve position frequently or promptly. The information that would have told an outsider how thin the cover had become arrived late and infrequently. Investors were not necessarily foolish. Many of them were working from numbers that were weeks out of date, in a situation that was changing daily. The second political shock came in September, when the governing party's Secretary General, José Francisco Ruiz Massieu, was assassinated in Mexico City. 2 killings of senior figures inside the ruling party in 6 months. Whatever an investor thought about the economics, the story of a stable one-party state managing a smooth transition was no longer available. On the 1st of December, 1994, Ernesto Zedillo was sworn in as president. He had not been the party's chosen candidate, he had been the campaign manager, pushed into the role after Colosio was killed. He inherited a currency ban that could no longer be defended, a reserve position that was almost gone, and $30 billion of dollar-linked debt coming due. What happened next is the part economists still teach, and they teach it as a lesson in how not to do it. A devaluation is a controlled demolition. If you are going to do it, you go far enough in one move that the market believes you are finished, and you announce it with a credible plan attached. What Mexico did was the opposite of that on both counts. On the 20th of December the government widened the band by about 15%, a partial devaluation, the smallest step it thought it could get away with. To anyone holding pesos, a small devaluation is not reassurance. It is proof that the promise can be broken, and an invitation to guess how much further it has to go. The reserves that were left disappeared in 2 days. On the 22nd of December, Mexico stopped defending the peso altogether and let it float. It fell about a third within days. By March it had lost roughly half its value against the dollar. The finance minister resigned within the week. And every Tesobono outstanding, every one of those promises to pay in dollars, had just become roughly twice as expensive to honor, measured in the only currency the government could actually print. This is the mechanism that makes currency crises different from ordinary recessions, and it is worth stating plainly. In a normal devaluation your exports get cheaper and the economy eventually rebalances. But if your debts are indexed to a foreign currency, devaluation does not just hurt, it multiplies what you owe at the precise moment your ability to pay collapses. The country had insured the market against its own failure, and then failed. Mexico could not pay. And an outright default on $30 billion, in a country that had just signed a trade agreement with the United States and shared a 2,000-mile border with it, was not a Mexican problem. Within weeks American officials were describing a Mexican collapse in terms of what would arrive at their own frontier. The American administration proposed a rescue, and Congress refused to approve it. Bailing out a foreign country was politically impossible weeks after an election. So the Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, used a fund that did not require congressional approval, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, created in the 1930s, and committed about $20 billion of it. It was legal. It was also, by any reading, a decision to rout around a legislature that had said no. Together with roughly $18 billion from the International Monetary Fund, the largest package it had ever assembled at that point, and about $10 billion arranged through the Bank for International Settlements, the total came to around $50 billion. And the terms are the detail that tells you what Washington actually thought of the borrower. Mexico's oil export earnings were pledged as security. Payments from foreign buyers of Mexican crude were to be routed through an account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where they could be seized if Mexico did not pay. A sovereign nation's oil revenue, held in a bank in another country, as collateral. In Mexico that condition was experienced as a national humiliation, and it is still remembered as one. Now the part that does not appear in the textbook chapter. To stop the peso falling further and to hold what money was left inside the country, interest rates had to go up violently. Short-term rates went above 70%. Ordinary borrowers, people with mortgages, farmers with equipment loans, small businesses with overdrafts, watched the cost of debts they had taken on in a stable-looking country multiply within months. Out of that came a movement called El Barzan, the yokestrap of an ox team. Hundreds of thousands of debtors, many of them farmers, organized against the banks and the courts. Their slogan was not a demand for forgiveness, and that is what made it land, Debo, no niego, pago lo que es justo. I owe, I do not deny it, I will pay what is fair. The economy contracted by about 6% in 1995, one of the worst single years in modern Mexican history. Inflation ran above 50%, erasing savings and wages together. Unemployment doubled. Millions of people who had been told for 6 years that they were living in a country on its way to the developed world were told, in the space of one winter, that they were not. And then there was the banking system, which had been lending at speed to a population that could no longer pay. The government created a fund to absorb the bank's bad loans and keep the payment system alive. The rescue worked, in the sense that the banks did not all fail. But the debts were converted into public debt, the estimated cost ran to something like a fifth of national output, and Mexican taxpayers were still servicing it decades later. The nickname arrived because the damage did not stay inside Mexico. Investors who had been happily buying emerging market debt looked at their portfolios and did not stop to distinguish one country from another. Argentina, which had a far harder currency peg and no direct connection to Mexican politics, lost close to a fifth of its bank deposits within months and fell into recession with unemployment near 18%. Argentina survived that scare, and survived it in a way that convinced its own government that its peg was unbreakable. That belief held for 6 more years, and then produced the largest sovereign default in history. If you have watched the Argentina file on this channel, this is where that story begins, not in 2001, but in the moment Buenos Aires drew the wrong conclusion from somebody else's collapse. On accountability, the record has to be stated precisely. Ernesto Zedillo, who inherited the situation, faced no criminal accusation over it. Carlos Salinas, the president under whom the debt was built, has never been convicted of any offense connected to this crisis and denies wrongdoing. He left the country and spent years abroad. His brother Raul was arrested and convicted in a separate murder case, but that conviction was overturned in 2005, and he was acquitted of illicit enrichment in 2013. The finance minister who held the December meeting resigned within days and was never charged with anything. What he did was widely criticized as a catastrophic misjudgment of sequence, not established as a crime, and the distinction matters, because the most damaging thing about that evening may simply be what it revealed. There was a list of people who found out first, and almost everybody in the country was not on it. Mexico repaid the American loans in January 1997, more than 3 years ahead of schedule. The United States Treasury did not lose money on the rescue, it made several $100 million in interest and fees. That fact is usually offered as the happy ending, and it is worth holding it next to the other numbers. The lender was repaid in full and at a profit, and the Mexican middle class was not repaid at all. What did change was structural, and it is the reason Mexico has not repeated this particular failure. The peso was left to float, so there is no longer a promise for the market to attack. The central bank was made operationally independent. Reserves were rebuilt to a level that would have looked absurd in 1994, and short-term dollar-indexed borrowing was abandoned as an instrument of policy. The lesson of this file is not that Mexico borrowed too much. It is what a government does when the truth becomes unaffordable. Devaluing in the spring of 1994 would have been humiliating and survivable. Instead, the state issued dollar-indexed debt to postpone the admission, and in doing so guaranteed that when the admission finally came, it would arrive multiplied. The Tesobono did not cause the crisis. It converted a difficult year into a lost decade of debt, and it did so quietly, in an instrument almost nobody outside the finance ministry could name. On this channel the ledger always comes due, and the file that comes due next is already open. Subscribe, and vote in the pinned comment for which empire falls after this one.